Welcome to Modern Anarchy, the podcast featuring real conversations with conscious objectors to the status quo. I'm your host, Nicole.
I tried to keep her quiet, but she's screaming inside of me. I tried to keep her hiding, oh, shut up. I tried to keep her quiet, but she's a wild, wild woman.
On today's episode, we have therapist, educator, and sex worker Raquel Savage join us for a conversation about the need for a more relationally focused world. Together, we talk about the healing power of intimacy, the isolation of our existential existence, and talking shit about the mental health system. Ooh, y'all, you know these are spicy conversations on the podcast. Quick story, y'all. I was just in a class where I had to do a presentation on pelvic floor therapy, which is a really effective treatment modality within a Western lens that can support people who have pain in their vagina with penetration. Sometimes we see this after sexual assaults. Sometimes we see this after pregnancy. Sometimes we see this from a range of different things. And I think it's important that therapists are aware that if their clients are experiencing this, this might be one piece that could be really helpful for their treatment from a Western lens compared to something like yoni massage therapy, which I've talked about in the podcast in the past. But y'all, I did my presentation on this, and afterwards my professor was like, yeah, that's like super great, you know, everyone saying it directly to the fellow therapist training in the room. Yeah, talking about sex is awkward, but we really need to be doing it. And y'all, at that moment, I made eye contact with one of my friends in the class who I knew understood what I was feeling in that moment, and we just both smiled gently to ourselves because I just want to say something. You know, I don't feel uncomfortable or awkward talking about sex, but it's interesting that you do. If we had any other diagnosis in our DSM that someone said they felt awkward talking about, then we would say, hey, that sounds like you got some bias going on and need some more education around that topic. And y'all, the DSM says that upwards of 42% of women will struggle with female orgasm disorder. Yeah, fat cat, that's right. 42% of women upwards. And that's what we know is reported, right? It's probably significantly more than that. Y'all, I hate that pathology lens to put that on a person and a diagnosis. But if our book of all powers be, you know, the DSM of what we can diagnose people with, has that in there, and we know it's upwards of 42%, and you come in here saying it's awkward to talk about this, you are part of the problem. And I get that, like, it's not your fault, right? It's the systems, it's the society that we all grew up in, so it's not you, but like, you can't just sit there and say that's awkward and not seek further education and training in it. Y'all, I'm gonna scream about this for the rest of my career because what? I mean, as Raquel said with her clients, she sometimes has clients that have other therapists, and those clients do not feel comfortable in their other therapist sessions to talk about their sex life with that clinician. Y'all, like, the awkwardness that therapists are feeling are creating a situation where clients don't feel able to bring that into the room. You know, like, is that causing harm? What a question. What a question. Maybe I will leave it to you, dear listener, to answer that for yourself. But I'm going to keep talking about it, and I'm happy that you're tuning in. I hope you're learning. I'm certainly learning a hell of a lot on this journey of this podcast, and I am thankful that you are tuning in each week with me to go on this process together to see where these guests and their nominations take us, because it is, one hell of a journey, and I am enjoying this ride, and I hope that you are too. I am sending you all so much love, and I hope you enjoy today's episode, and tune in. For the listener who has never met you, never heard of you, how would you introduce yourself?
I would introduce myself as Raquel Savage. I use she and her pronouns, and I'm a therapist, educator, and sex worker. That's the short version of my introduction.
I think there's a lot to talk about there.
There is a lot to unpack.
Yeah, yeah. I'm curious, where are your passions at now? What is that thing that you're sharing with the world, really like feeling in your heart right now?
Definitely ECC, the Equitable Care Certification, which is a certification that my colleague Angie Gunn and I have been working on for a couple of years. And it's essentially a 24-hour, which is 12 courses, certification program for clinicians to learn how to work with sex workers as therapy clients. I think that that's probably my passion project right now.
Mm-hmm. And so I'll ask the question, well, why is this needed? Why do you think we need this?
Yeah, I mean, so I think as both a sex worker and a therapist, I'm uniquely positioned to see the intersection of those two identities or those two experiences. And as a client of therapy for my entire life, I recognize how many flaws and limitations and barriers there are to competent care generally, and then specifically as a sex worker. When I was in my graduate program, of course, we have like a multicultural class where we try to cover like all of the marginalized identities in one fucking course, which is ridiculous.
Right?
However, in that course, which would be the only course that we would talk about sex workers in, we didn't talk about sex workers. And the only time that we ever mentioned sex workers in my graduate program was when we talked about victims of trafficking.
Mm,
And specifically, the rhetoric around that one conversation, and it was one conversation in one course, one time. The rhetoric around that conversation was that sex workers bad, porn leads to trafficking, and all sex workers are trafficking victims. And it was a horrific conversation that was hard to sit through as a sex worker. Throughout my experience in grad school and sitting with my peers, I realized no one was going to be graduating with the skills or knowledge or empathy to work with sex workers, and then more broadly with women or with people who are have autonomy around their sexuality or have any understanding of capitalism and how labor shows up in our lives and like just systems of oppression generally, just like no one is going to fucking know what to do with this. And so, yeah, I think that that personally prompted me to have an interest, and that's what made me start after I graduated. I said, I'm not going to work anywhere until I can work in my own place. And then I started Zep Wellness, which is my own nonprofit, and we serve specifically sex worker communities. And it wasn't until later, until I met Angie and we started doing ECC. But I think just personally, that was my own experience. That was like, wow, I'm recognizing just the limitations in how clinicians are educated. I am lucky enough to say that I have never had a personal bad experience with a therapist as a sex worker because the therapist that I have, who I've had for like 6 years, is incredible and I love her and she's amazing. And I don't even think that she knows anything about sex work, but she's just not judgmental and she's more on a like relational aspect. She just wants to be in the moment here with me rather than be like, wait, what is that? And it's an umbrella term and what she doesn't get into that. So I'm really lucky to have not had bad experiences. However, I know that that's not the norm. Most people who do any kind of sex work who go to therapy have shitty experiences where therapists, at minimum, show their bias through body language. But typically, more often, it's more explicit in that there's an assumption of trauma, there's an assumption of childhood trauma, there's an assumption of exploitation, there's an assumption that people want to or need to get out or leave this industry. So yeah, that was pretty, like, lengthy, but, there are a lot of reasons why sex workers specifically need competent and unique care and how that knowledge can benefit all clients, including people who are not sex workers.
yes. It is lengthy and I love it. That's what I wanted, right? Because I think that's exactly what needs to be said in this space is that I would say there's harm being done from the lack of education around this.
Absolutely. 100%. And again, to sex workers and to folks who are not sex workers as well. Because really the bigger issue is that clinicians, we don't learn about systems of oppression at all. Like we
No.
just, it's actually really ridiculous to think about what we do learn about and
Yeah.
what is really useful in client like in interactions with other humans and how we don't learn about trauma either. It's like ridiculous to think about the barriers to in mental health. So yeah.
Yeah, I talk about that a lot because I'm still in school for my doctorate right now, and so I'm always talking about how the fact that trauma is not a required course. I know, right? Right? Right?
It, it's really ridiculous. And I think I'm lucky to be who I am, I guess, and I don't know, to have my own like interests and my own agency because when it was time for me to do my practicum and internship, I was trying to decide where I wanted to do it. And I initially was going to do it at like an LGBT center. And ultimately, I took a class with my now supervisor, who's been my supervisor for many years, was also previously my professor. And I forget what the course was, but in one of the courses, she mentioned trauma. And we just like talked briefly about like the physiology, the neurology, the chemistry of trauma and how it impacts us. And I remember just being so fascinated and it was like a light bulb went off and I was like, why is this not more of our conversation? Because it sounds like something that almost everyone experiences. So if we're therapists, we should know this. And so I asked her for more information and I ended up doing my practicum and internship at a trauma resolution center
Yeah.
where I learned techniques that were specific to processing trauma that were not talk therapy. And then that opened up a whole other thing about limitations around mental health, which is the therapists don't know about trauma and they're using fucking CBT, so nobody's getting better and it's horrific. More broadly than just sex workers being my like part and my niche and my community and my people, I'm also really all of my work is really grounded in trauma and
Mhm.
understanding trauma and using approaches that actually work to process trauma, and not just asking people to talk about their trauma and then tell them that they're having cognitive distortions because of the way that they think or, whatever else.
Right, right. And then the collective trauma that we've all experienced, right? Working under the systems of oppression. That's like a whole conversation that is not talked about in psychology enough, I would say, because the reality is that plays into a lot of these things. At times, I'm frequently shocked that we're not all depressed, given, the world that we see, the laws and the things going on. I mean, that seems like a reasonable response to the social conditions that
Yeah,
we are experiencing, right? And I don't think that conversation of that nuanced nature of what's going on a systems level is talked about enough. And especially when you bring that into something like sexuality, right? That is
yeah,
a whole thing that we've experienced. So there's no classes on sex. And just like you said, like, if everyone's experienced trauma, maybe we should have a class on it. If everyone has some sort of relationship to sexuality, even if you're asexual, you have a relationship to sexuality in some form, no class, no discussion. And yet that comes up in the therapy room. And how are clinicians trained for that?
yeah. And I think in my graduate program, we did have a human sexuality class, but it was really centered around like, it was really just hella vanilla, which
Uh,
like only you would only like know that if you are not vanilla, if that makes sense. Like I think
right.
for the people who are just, I don't know, but it was just very much, it was very, very centered around treating couples, around intimacy, not even so much sex and sexuality or the exploration of unpacking things around having a sex negative experience or trauma around sex. I mean, those are the things that I think are most important. Um,
Right.
we don't get to the important bits that show up most frequently with clients. And this is why, which brings us to so much harm is being done because clinicians are ill prepared to deal with these conversations once they're happening. And I think particularly around sex, at least from what I understand, and the clients who come to see me who know that I'm a sex worker, and my clients are not always sex workers. They're either sex workers or people who know that I'm a sex worker and they're like, this is why I want to see you because I know I can come in and talk about sex and not feel embarrassed.
Right.
When they come to me, particularly those who are not sex workers, what I often hear is that they have other therapists and they're not talking about these things with them because they don't know how to broach the subject because they don't feel comfortable. And um, it's wild because I think that it is necessary or a good, I don't know, reflection of your competency that you can at least engage in low level, vulnerable, exploring, curious, open kind of conversations around sex and sexuality, even if that's not your strong suit. And
Sure.
that does not seem to be the case at all.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. yes, just a basic openness to it. You don't have to be an expert, and if it falls
Right.
outside of your scope, if it is too triggering based on your own things, right? That's when you refer out. But like just basically having that ability to hold that conversation for someone, I would say is a crucial part of what we should be trained in. And
Yeah.
it's great that you had that human sexuality course, but I didn't, right? And that's not a requirement. So I'm curious, like, at that point, then, what we're doing is we're allowing clinicians to work from their own frame of reference, which is problematic because, like you said earlier, that can be vanilla. And frequently, a lot of people don't fall into that category. But if that's the frame of your therapist lens, then anything outside of that can become pathology real fast, real quick.
And not only is it that we're not teaching clinicians about like systems of oppression more broadly, and so it means that they're leaning on their own perspective and framework. The other piece is that we're also teaching clinicians to be objective.
Mm,
And I have such a fucking problem with that as practice in
throw it
terms.
out. Let's hear it.
I was gonna say a lot of my beliefs I think generally are like pretty provocative and also they're right mostly.
I love
Like
it so
whatever.
much.
Um I think a lot of the things that we learn in our graduate program, as we know, are like based around cis white male fucking from the 19 whatever the fuck, right? It's like not any kind of modern or inclusive knowledge. And that includes perspectives on a variety of things, including like suicidality. We could talk about that's a whole other fucking conversation, but also this idea of objectivity. And I remember many times throughout my graduate program being told, leave your bias at the door, leave your this at the door, don't bring your bias into the thing. And it's like, that is such a white supremacist practice to be able to say, leave your ABC at the door. Because the reality is that your capacity to leave something at the door is revolves around your proximity to privilege, like your ability to just kind of separate. So on the flip side of that, like as a Black, queer, autistic, sex working therapist, I can't leave those identities at the door. And so that's the first part is the whole idea of being objective is based in white supremacist ideology because it is framed around privilege and the capacity to like separate yourself from your identities. The second piece of that is the assumption that how your identities show up in therapeutic spaces are inherently bad.
Mm,
And I think the opposite of that. And I think that what we miss there then is this piece about learning how to be discerning.
mm,
So for me, for instance, all of my identities, my proximity to Blackness, my womanhood, my sex worker identity, my autism, my whatever the fuck, my politic more broadly, very much so informs how I work with my clients because it means that if they say something, I might say, so for instance, if I have a client who has a family member who uses drugs and they come in and they're like, well, my brother is a junkie and you know they're an addict and da, 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 and they start talking about AA and they never do it successfully and they always relapse. I might say, depending on where we are in the therapy and like if it feels appropriate, right? This is a piece of discernment. That's a skill
right.
to recognize when it's the right time to say a thing. I may say, I'd love to invite you to learn about harm reduction. I'd love to talk to you about how 12-step programs are almost never successful and they're very faith-based and they don't work for a lot of people. I love to talk to you about language and how people who use drugs perhaps is a more empathetic term than addict or junkie. And I'd love to invite you to think about how the criminalization of drugs makes that, you know, it's like all of this. And that's
Yes.
how my identities show up in a therapeutic space in a useful and competent way. And again, to go back to the other piece is it's about discernment. It's not about leaving everything at the door and pretending I have no other identities or ideologies. It's about figuring out how I can use those in ways that are going to be beneficial for my client. And I think the other piece of that comes in with disclosure too, is in our graduate program, we always learn they shouldn't know anything about you. It's blank slate and blah, blah, blah. And that to me, again, going back to the like white supremacist, cis het male, all of that bullshit, it creates this barrier between you and your client that you are not a human or like that you, so it prohibits this like ability to have shared experiences, which deepen intimacy, which I think are so, and that's the relational aspect of therapy, which I think is so important in building rapport. And again, though, the piece is not gossip to your client or tell them everything about your life. The point is use disclosure in ways that amplify and strengthen the therapeutic relationship. So I think even when I talk about me being a sex worker and a therapist, people who are like super vanilla, not sex workers, don't understand. They think I'm going into session and being like, I sucked dick for $500 this weekend and I was doing this and I was shaking my ass and thinking that I'm like taking up space in session in that way, when really it's like a sex worker client comes to session and they're like, I had a bomb ass week at the club. I made blah, blah, blah amount of money. And I'm like, I love that for you. I know how it feels to make your bag. Like I see you. And they're like, yeah, right. So like that's how it actually looks in real time. So that disclosure piece, I think goes back to this objectivity thing, which is just to me generally a bullshit kind of white supremacist perspective.
Yeah. 100%. 100%. Because one, existentially, we're never going to be able to leave that bias at the door, right? That is just a reality of the world that we're living in and the fact that I am restricted to my lens of what I see the world. And that is for each person, regardless. Okay. There is never this completely unbiased perspective. I don't think liberation psychology would even ascribe to that idea because that's just like not possible. And on top of that, like you said, it's the framework then of like these normal white cis het identities. So yeah, I can leave it at the door because that's what everyone has, right? Everyone's in that framework. It's like that's not the framework that I'm living in. And so I do see the world through a different lens that is going to be inevitable. And I love that nuance that you said of it's not so much that you're taking up space with your identities there, but you are able to hold them in a way that you're able to be in relationship with the other person, that they can be seen, because
Yeah.
that client that you have could come to someone else who is so uncomfortable about sex that they would never bring that up in the room. And then
Yeah.
what does that create? That creates shame around it because I don't feel like I can bring this part to myself to my therapist. So I'm going to be in shame about it, which is
Yeah.
what we know creates all of the psychological distress is feeling like I can't be accepted for this part of myself.
Yes. Quite literally, I would say the root of much of our trauma is the deep, like somatic, visceral, whatever word we want to use, felt sense of not feeling seen. It's really
Yes.
not like the traumas that we experience. It is the aftermath of that, which is not being seen, not being witnessed, not being held, not being, and I don't even mean held physically, sometimes physically, yes, but also mean like, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Midsummer. That's one of my favorite movies.
Yes. When they
There's
have
a
that
scene,
moment.
yeah, there's a scene where they're like crying, but there's another scene where and I forget his name now that I'm talking about it, but he says to Danny, like, do you feel held by him? And it's not held in the sense of like, does he hug you? It's held as in, does your identity, does your soul, do you feel seen by him? And that is in a greater sense in that movie is so funny. And I love that movie so much. But that's the core of it is being seen is exactly.
Mhm.
So yeah, that's, and I think that piece is missing, and we don't talk about that in graduate school either. And I think that that's mostly because we all generally have such a hard time with our feelings, including therapists.
Yep.
And I think bigger, more important than all of the skills that we learn or have or whatever the fuck is in our toolbox is like, are you secure? I don't know if that's even the word I want to use, but are you secure enough in your own body? And do you feel safe enough in your own body, which means you have worked through at least, or you have begun to work through some of your stuff and identify your own shit. Are you secure enough, safe enough in your own body and the icky kind of feelings that you potentially could feel to model experiencing that with your client who's struggling with that? And like just how that kind of like regulation work as humans,
Mhm.
like that's the core of what we're all missing, which is this being seen piece.
Yes, that's why I've always loved relational cultural theory because that's what it talks about is that need to have that relationship. But you know what's much easier? You know what's so much easier is to say, I'm going to come into this room and we're going to do CBT and I'm going to have a thought log and we're going to push on these intrusive thoughts and that's all we're going to do for today actually. And I hear that. That's so much easier, right? It is so much easier to look at the work in that frame of like A plus B equals this, right? But that's not the reality of what people are needing. The
Right.
traumas occur, and you need to be able to sit with someone who does not give you that flat affect, who does not give you that tabula rasa, who can be with you in a way that is grounded and secure, right? Where you've processed through your own stuff so that it does not become the client caretaking for you in the room, but that you're able to go there with them when they're talking about that horrible atrocity and crying and sobbing in that. You don't have a blank face and you don't look at them with that blank face. I would say that causes even more harm because it's having a relationship where you're going somewhere and you're not being seen by the other person.
Yep. I would say that the reason that I've been with my current therapist as long as I have is not only because we do EMDR and I'm a EMDR stan and it has changed my life, but also because she's like the most fucking regulated person I've ever met in my life. I don't know what the fuck. I need to ask her. I've been talking about this with other people more recently.
Yeah.
Just as I continue to try to model that in my therapy session.
Totally.
But, like, I don't know if she just, like, hasn't had a hard life. No, it's, like, not hard to be in her body or what, but she literally is like,
Mm.
I could be saying the most horrific and have said the most horrific shit. And like you said, she's not giving me blank what she mostly is doing is breathing.
Mm.
Like, she's doing that, and she's just,
Yeah.
like, and just taking a breath, and which makes me take a breath, right? Which is the whole fucking
Mhm.
point. And so just like co-regulating with her while I'm having a fucking meltdown is just like incredible. And she's also, and I think that, and this came up like throughout school too, when I have gone to really dark places, she has emoted with me.
Mm.
Like and she's cried sometimes, but not in ways where it's like she's like, and it's like, whatever. She's deeply feeling what I'm feeling, which is what allows me to feel it with her. Because,
Yes.
like you said, she's going there with me. And so it's not just me like having an experience and her being like, wow, how does that feel? She's like,
Right.
I feel it already. I'm crying with you. How, oh my God, that's painful. And like, it's quite literally, but that her capacity to do that is informed by that she probably has worked through her shit because otherwise she wouldn't be able to be there with me. She'd
Right.
be her own like and again, these are things that I'm still practicing too. Like when people come to me about specific things and they trigger, activate me in certain ways, that means I'm no longer able to hold space for that person because
Mhm.
I'm thinking about well, when I was 10 and my dad said this and when my da, 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 and my own sexual assault experience,
Mhm.
whatever, that takes you out of the
Oh,
I'm here with you. So yeah, it's so much. And I think that there is something about graduate school that doesn't require therapists to get therapy enough.
I know,
Like,
isn't it
I have
wild?
thought about this. I'm like, every therapist in graduate school should be doing the EMDR or somatic experiencing or something like that because you can't be with and therapists. Yeah, it's easier to do like CBT because that means the therapist doesn't have to go there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And I mean, we know CBT is helpful in certain stages of where people are at. Everyone's at different, parts of the journey. And like when you're severely dysregulated, CBT is super helpful to like come back to the reality and come back to the present. But that's not the whole healing continuum. And I think that the healing continuum happens in these relational dynamics. And I know that what you're talking about with your therapist has been what has been therapeutic for me. I remember talking about my sexual assault and my therapist being brought to tears as I was sobbing, again, in a controlled way. But what it made me feel was seen in that
Right.
moment in my pain, that someone else understood and was looking at me and validated the deep pain that was there. And so I always carried that before I went into the school of knowing that that's how I wanted to show up in the room with my clients, controlled, able to go there with them and help them regulate in that. And so when I've talked about my work of doing that sort of connection with my clients, some of my other colleagues in class have been worried to go there because of the potential professionalism. I don't want to cry. I know, exactly. But I think that's why this is an important conversation to have because they'd be like, oh, well, I don't know if that's professional. I don't want to like have that moment in the room. And like, Yeah, what would you say to that? I'm curious. What would you say to that person who worries about it being unprofessional
I
to be
mean,
human?
it's hard for me to even embody that concept long enough to like respond
Yeah.
and have
Yeah.
a rebuttal or have a response. Uh, because I'm just so not interested in being professional, like in any way. But I think mostly beyond needing to unpack your white supremacy, which is what the idea of professionalism stems from. Separate from that, I really think it does go back to everything we've been talking about, which is us practicing our own capacity to feel our feelings. Because when you say, "Oh, I don't want to go there. I don't want to be unprofessional," again, separate from the like respectability politics shit, it sounds like fear. It sounds like if I go there, then I might fucking spiral, or I'm scared to go there. And so I think it is a moment to practice doing what we ask our clients to do, which is feel their feelings. And this is why I love doing EMDR with people, because I've been doing EMDR for many years, but I did like 3 or 4 years before I started doing it with clients. So I know what it's fucking like, and I know that it's horrific and but deeply rewarding, obviously. But and it is just interesting to think about, and I don't think I've ever really thought about it this in depth until this moment, but it is interesting to think about all of the many clinicians in the world and throughout history, whatever, who are supposed to be creating space for people to be deeply vulnerable, but have never gone there themselves.
Yeah.
And that just fundamentally, the math doesn't math.
Totally. Immediately in my head, I was thinking about the psychedelic assisted therapy, and there's been conversations of whether it's ethical to be a clinician in that space that has never done it, right? Can you
No,
really walk someone through a psychedelic experience if you've never done it yourself?
no, then no. How could
Right.
you? I mean,
Right?
yeah, I don't think that, because coming to a therapeutic space with a lot of shit and having never felt seen is horrifying. It's scary, and it's a total practice to be able to even let yourself go there minimally with a therapist. So to have deeper processing experiences like somatic work or like any drugs requires just like so much safety that, yeah, if a clinician just has like not done anything like that, I don't know how they would be able to empathize or co-regulate. Yeah, like I don't know. I think about even me as a client of therapy with my therapist who I love, like, and how I ask my clients like to acknowledge what's going on in their body as it's happening, and how much of a struggle that's been for me throughout my like therapy, my adult therapy journey, and that it looks so different from what we are taught therapy spaces look like. Because at least from my experience, we're taught that therapy is like talking, and it's like, I feel this and what's going on and what do you think about this? When in reality, it's like when I'm mid processing, I might need to get up and scream. And I mean like scream, not like a
Mhm,
bullshit,
mhm.
"I'm mad." I mean like blood curdling scream. I might need to rip paper up. I might need to just do some weird shit with my fucking body. Doing that is like deeply impactful for the healing process, because you're doing what your body needs in the moment that it didn't get to do. You're listening to your body as things are happening. So you're allowing the process to process, and not doing those things does the opposite. It means you're doing more of ignoring your body, but it's scary and it's like embarrassing. And so it's only if you have a therapist who is encouraging you to do that, or who models it for you. Yeah. So it's just or effective therapy, in my opinion, doesn't look anything like what we're taught in school.
Yes, because it all comes back to this idea that it's all up here in the brain, which I would say is like a white colonial patriarchal idea that has disconnected us from the body so much so that says it's all up here, it's all up here. But the reality is, what do animals do when they go through a trauma? They
Yeah.
shake.
And
They shake. And we have just completely forgot the reality that we are still embodied souls, right? It is not all cognitive. There is a whole half of this experience, maybe more than half, who knows, but at least a whole half, I would say, that is body. And this is why I scream on this podcast about the fact that I haven't had any somatic training. That is not a requirement in my training. That is not talked about at all. At all.
It's pretty horrific. It's pretty horrific, honestly. Or even just like crying, allowing yourself to really ugly cry. Like, bitch, I have really ugly cried with my therapist, like for
Yeah.
real. Like,
Mhm.
have you ever been crying and it becomes like an out of body experience where you like see yourself and you're like happy, which like, bitch, you look ridiculous. But then you're also just like, but I need to just like do
I
the
need to
thing.
go there.
But you're also like, if there was cameras in here, I would be so embarrassed. Like, I'm embarrassing. But you just have to fucking do it. And it's like, uh, and yeah, you also have to be a therapist who can sit across from that and like be with that.
Mhm.
And most therapists are regular people who have not felt their feelings and have not done that.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
I think like the most healing things that I have done in therapeutic spaces or like adjacent to that are really ugly crying, like for real, like
Yes.
attempting to be as how do I even want to say this? Like not surveilling myself, like not surveilling myself, if that's even a word, in a way that that my body can just do what it needs to do and not be thinking, not doing what I just said, which is like this out of body experience where I'm like, what are you doing? So like doing that in the moment, plus going to rage rooms and breaking a shitload of stuff and crying while I do it and on the way home. Like
Mm.
that has been the most 100% healing part of my like therapeutic journey.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. It reminds me of like that inner child moment where I can feel that bubble up. And
Yeah.
it always throws me for a loop, because at least for me, I'll be in therapy talking about something and I feel fine. And then all of a sudden I get that like little like tickle of like tears coming and I'm like, oof, something's here. And like that's when I get that moment of do I want to continue to go in that path and
Right.
like open it, or do I suppress it and say, oh, now's not the time. And I think what
Right.
I've noticed has been interesting as someone who, yeah, is having clients now and becoming that role for other people. It's been interesting to step into the role with my own therapist and be like, yeah, I need to go to that ugly cry space and not hold on so tightly to being composed. This is the space where it is literally the controlled container where I am going there and having that moment where I can quote unquote fall apart to my inner child's like rage and tears and pain there and be
Yeah.
held with someone.
Have you done both in person and telehealth?
Yeah.
Do you see a difference in how you experience therapy based on in person or online?
For my clients or for me as a client?
Maybe both.
Yeah. So with me as a client, I started in person and then the pandemic, then we haven't gone back. So I think that that is an interesting relationship because we had years before the pandemic established, right? But I would say that I think in person creates a different experience. It's the same time I've put it through the frame of like FaceTiming a friend, right? Like you feel them, you see them. But the reality is being in person, and I do think you feel energetically, like I feel energetically connected to you because we're keeping eye contact, we're body language, mirror neurons are probably all going on. But there is a different sense, I would say, to being in person and feeling that person, seeing the whole body, seeing the embodied space instead of this flat screen. I think it does make a difference. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so too. I was just thinking about when I have like full body cried, ugly cried,
Yeah.
and did it feel more like rewarding online
Mhm.
versus in person? And I definitely think in person. And this is with the same therapist. Like I've done both telehealth and in person
Sure.
before, and that's like a whole other conversation just about like touch and
Mhm.
how like as therapists we're taught like don't ever touch anyone ever, which I know is like for the most part probably a good policy, but also the moments that I had those like needing to cry, it was not only safe because I was sitting across from this person who is very regulated and could hold that
Yeah.
for me.
Right.
It was also because like she would like lean forward and she would like
Mm.
be with me kind of physically. And when we did EMDR, she would tap my knees or tap the
Yeah.
top of my knees.
Uh-huh.
And so sometimes so during sets, she might just rest her hands on my knees. And I feel like to therapists in grad school, that would be like, oh, they would freak the fuck out at that concept.
Totally.
But it felt good. Like, not only did I know that someone was there with me, there's all, you know how like when someone like drags their hand, like you get like tinglies?
Sure. Yeah.
It also was that. And she wasn't like doing that. It was just her hands resting. But there was
Right.
something about the sensation that made my body feel good and like tingly, and not in a fucking sexual way, just in a like, it allowed me to relax more and to be more focused on and to be grounded. Like if I'm dissociating, then I have this like kind of feel, anyway, so that's my long way of saying I definitely think that there are like limitations to online, I do all exclusively online at this point.
I
So
know. Same.
it is what it is, but there is, I think, something really beneficial about being able to feel your feelings and your big, scary feelings across from someone who is equipped to see them and to be okay with that.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And I think, at least for me, when we're having this conversation, I like can't get around the fact of thinking about capitalism and how healing happens in relationships.
You're
And my ideal world is a world where we wouldn't need that therapy room for these things, because I think what we're hitting on is the reality that I would like to caveat that I think the therapeutic relationship and the perspective of it when it's not someone in your relational world is quite unique. And I do think that is beautiful. But at the same time, I think that we need to be able to do this work with our community, because our
Yeah,
community could hold us. Our community can be there. Our community can do that. And so, like, as you're saying all these things, I just feel really conflicted with the reality that, like, this is the system we're under. And then this is how we're trying to put a healing relationship into a professional context, which we
right.
need with the system we're in. But then we found these like really hard limitations of like, maybe this person truly needs a hug because we're human beings and we need touch.
Yeah, deeply. The entire point is that the relational aspect of therapy is the most profound part of feeling and
Mhm.
healing, and it is not focused on enough in our learning or in our professional development unless we choose it to be a perspective that we think is important personally.
Right, exactly. Which is why I've talked about on this podcast the importance of like people who do have a therapist remembering that they're a human with their own existential lens. And, might be times where you feel judgment from them, and that could be coming from their own lens. And it's important to remember that like these therapists ourselves, we are human beings. And we do not have the sense of like knowing all of the information and the right way to live. And I think when you kind of put therapists into that category, that's when we start to have problems like this, because we don't understand the humanness of all of us.
Yeah. These kinds of conversations are my favorite because I love to talk shit about mental health.
Totally. Well, because it's a system. It's a system that needs to be critiqued. And I really appreciate that conversation, because I'm not taking this shit at face value. There's tons of problems, and I feel it every single day when I'm in school, you know?
I know. I know. And I did a lecture with graduate and PhD students, future counselors, talking about dynamics of abuse. And one of the things that I said to them was, if you take nothing else just away from this conversation, I encourage you to like question everything that you learn in school. And one of the students was just like, how? I don't like what they were like, the way that a studious person would ask for like, can you give me the like, how do I like the steps, the instructions?
Yes.
And it was so funny because it's not that, it's really just intuitive, but that it's also hard to teach that. On one hand, me being as like rebellious as I am has caused a lot of problems for me in my life, in academic spaces or otherwise. And I feel so lucky that I am like inherently disruptive and question everything because it has led to this particular version of myself. And it doesn't feel hard for me, or I don't need a manual or instructions to be able to identify like that doesn't feel right. What the fuck is that? Let me ask a question.
Yeah.
And that is like partnered with that I have never trusted or gave a fuck about authority, which is like another piece of the grad school thing is I'm learning a thing from a professor who must know and in a program that must have the right information. And it's like, no, it's
Right,
no,
exactly.
it's
That's a
a
Right, and that's a formalized system of learning that is patriarchal and says this is the way to do it, like, lived experience doesn't have anything to teach us. We can also go back to, like, ancient wisdom, right, beyond our, like, paradigm of just, like, basic, research and evidence-based things, right? Maybe we go back to time-based things that have been going on before even the field of psychology was created. I don't know, what a thought. I mean, I share with you in that same level of, like, I've always questioned things, and it has created, like, a sense of rage in my body at times
yeah.
in class that has gotten me in not necessarily got me in trouble, but I do poke boundaries and push, but I think it's so needed, and especially for me right now, I'm training in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, and so I have quite literally been in my classes specifically for, psychopharmacology and gotten, like, one professor with a PhD saying one thing about the potential for causing psychosis on psychedelics, and then my supervisor with a PhD telling me the exact opposite information.
Yeah.
What kind of position does that put me in as a student when I'm here getting this over here saying yes and here saying no? I can't but help question all the systems at that point because I'm
You
getting experts giving me opposite opinions. And so someone's got to sit in between that and like suss that out. And I think that that's like, that example is what happens on large scale with all of psychology is people have different lenses, perspectives, they've seen different research, they've seen different things, and that creates our existential bias that we can never leave.
Yeah. For I'm so fascinated by the idea of any kinds of drugs in therapy, not from the perspective I think it's bad, from the perspective of my body cannot fucking tolerate drugs. Like all of my
Mm,
friends always in life have been like, they do all the drugs and I'm the one who has a panic attack every fucking time.
totally.
First time I tried coke, had a panic attack.
Yeah.
What if I smoked weed when I was like younger, but I always hated it. It always gave me anxiety. And like in my adult life, when I've attempted to smoke weed, full on panic. Everything just
Yeah.
makes me fucking panic.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So I have had friends who have done acid, who have done shrooms, and they're like, "You should do it. It would be great. It'd be wonderful." And I'm like, I know for a fact if I did that, I would die. And I also have a friend who like casually like does ketamine, and I know that ketamine is one of the other things that people are kind of experimenting with in terms of therapy.
Mhm.
And I think so what my fascination is I feel a sense of maybe jealousy because I can imagine how profound a healing experience could be
Right.
with the assistance of substances, and that is not an experience I probably will ever
Totally.
have, because if I do any drugs besides fucking Xanax, I can handle my body can tolerate Xanax and alcohol,
Yeah.
and Xanax is literally the pill version of alcohol, so it makes sense why those 2 are, like, good for me, but otherwise, it's like,
Yeah.
I will literally have a panic attack and die.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So to clarify though, that experience is based off of cocaine and also weed, or have you tried the other substances and
I
also
have
had that
not
experience?
tried acid, I have not tried shrooms, I have not tried ketamine. I have tried ecstasy, coke,
Okay.
weed, some pills like, Valium and
Right.
Oxy, like
Right.
that. I think that that's it. So I have not tried the ones that I guess that are being researched, but the reality in my body and brain is that I shouldn't or can't because I've had such bad experiences with other drugs. Like, and so I know that that's like factually and logically and academically not true. Emotionally, it feels true, which is
Totally.
a barrier.
Totally. And it does because then when we think about set and setting, right? If you're coming into it with
Right.
that mindset, like you're almost priming it to happen in that same way. Right, right, right. But I will say they're different. And I know specifically my supervisor has talked about how, which was fascinating to me, like knowing someone who works in a psychedelic space, does all these things. I'm a regular cannabis user, right? Someone who has anxiety and it primes things at certain times, but for the most part, I enjoy myself on it. I asked him about it and he was like, yeah, no, never. It causes complete like anxiety, all these things, but then like has explored other psychedelics to deep levels, which I was like, how? Because I figured if you were anxious on one, you'd also be
Right,
anxious on
right,
the
right.
other, but they create different experiences. And even something like ecstasy and MDMA is a amplifier, a stimulant, right? Like cocaine, like these are the ones that are going to get that.
Plants are not good for me.
Yeah. So,
They're not good for me.
well, I will say that mushrooms are not a stimulant. So you can take that
I
information
know.
wherever way you want.
I know that people also have mixed feelings about weed, whether it's a stimulant or depressant, or rather that it could be both. And I personally experience weed as a stimulant, not
Totally,
as a
totally. Right. It gets the neurons firing really quickly. So when you have anxiety, that can just, like hit
This is
that,
why I love Xanax and alcohol because
not to be mixed together, to be clear.
no, not
Very, yeah, I'm like, hold on, to be clear, very dangerous together.
they're not do them together, folks. Not really,
Yeah.
but because it brings I feel,
Totally.
and I think it's also it might be like an autistic thing too. It's like
Mm,
with stimulants, and this is a joke that I've just like always made about weed, and I never really got it until later in life. But I always say like I don't know what to do with my hands. Like now, it's
mm,
like I become so aware of my body
yeah.
in a way that is like I become robotic, and it's like I'm overthinking, and and my ability to mask is gone because I'm like, you put your hand here and then you talk like this, and then you should say this thing next. And like I'm already doing that when I'm sober. It's like trying to look like a normal human person. And when I'm on stimulants, it's like I have no sense of control over that. Whereas when I'm on any kind of depressant, I don't give a fuck about any of that. So it's
Yes.
nice to not have to have that internal thought process. And so I think there's that piece of it too. I know it would be different in like a therapeutic setting where I'm not having to like look cool or perform in any capacity.
Totally.
But yeah, I am so fascinated by that. And I will be so interested as the years go on to see like what the research suggests and what people's experiences are.
Right. Yeah. Cause I mean, I think there's like so much nuanced conversation about psychedelics because there's different types and different
Yeah.
things, and then subsequently different experiences on these different medicines. And so it's not like one fits all for people, but and I think this is where it all gets interesting. The research isn't out there yet, so we don't know, but like hearing accounts of how, psilocybin use could be helpful for someone with OCD to be able to like because it helps them, unlike weed or other things, to actually relax into that and feel a little bit less rigid and for a moment think like maybe I don't have to actually reenact that pattern because I feel a little bit calmer because of the medicine, right? So I am so excited to be in this space and to be navigating it. It's full of a lot of questions, a lot of risks, and a lot of all those things, but it is 100% what has put me into that same space that you've talked about of like pushing the system and really asking deep questions because the world where so many of us are on antipsychotics with heavy, heavy side effects, antidepressants, ones that I've been on myself with heavy side effects, compared to these other medicines that we're still exploring, I think there's so much more to do in that space.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's so much room for growth and it is so fascinating. And generally that's another piece of like the white supremacist, I don't know, neurotypical or like respectability, whatever bullshit is just healing and drugs as a coping resource and what kind of drug means what in terms of like someone who does coke, if they're white, is like cool. But if someone who is black is, does coke, then they're a fucking crackhead. And like, and just how all of those things inform how we understand drugs and drug use and
Mhm.
specifically around drugs as a resource for
Right.
coping, and drugs as a tool for healing. So
Mhm.
it is really interesting. And I know very, very little, but I'm 100% on the like harm reduction.
Right.
Yes to drugs.
Right. Right.
So that's my like,
Totally right. Because coffee every day is fine. My benzo every day is fine.
and for me, I'll die if I drink
Yeah.
coffee because it's a fucking stimulant. I literally, if I have it, I'm like, oh, I want to be cute and get some Starbucks. Prepare to have a panic attack later tonight.
Totally. I had to quit too. It's too much. It's too much. I can't do it. But
Not
it's
fair.
And it's so true, like, bringing in that, like, that liberation psychology, that systemic, like, look at it, like, someone who is living on the streets saying that, "I do meth," right? And you ask that person, "Well, what about meth works for you?" Right? Harm reduction lens, like, "What is it about meth that you are enjoying?" "Well, I have things to do outside, and it allows me to go to work in that capacity and work outside and not have to feel the cold as much." Okay, y'all, we gotta talk about some systemic shit going on right here because that person is using that medicine for them in that capacity to be able to live in cold environments outside. And
100%.
yet, we'll say drug user,
Yep.
addict.
Yep.
Like, hold on, look at their societal context
Yep.
and what they're doing to survive in that. And then look at the other people, yeah, in a business job, stressed out beyond capacity, goes to a psychiatrist who then is like, well, here's the benzo for your stress. And that's okay, because that's
Exactly.
your social conditioning. Totally fine.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Give me some Xanax.
Yeah, which is a great tool. So
So
let's
wonderful.
And we need to see that context in a larger societal scale of what's going on, of why these medicines are helpful for people, and what are the systemic factors that are leading to people needing to use these things because of the system.
Yes, and those conversations, of course, aren't happening in grad school either. I mean,
Yeah.
I remember taking I don't even remember what the class was called, like an addictions class. And
Yeah.
I remember we learned about like the 12-step programs, and one of our homework activities was to visit like an NA or an AA or whatever. And that's horrifying. That's horrifying to know that that's the framework that clinicians are going into the world with, which is drugs are bad. People who do drugs are bad. That's that. Get everyone, quote, clean. What a horrific lens for therapists to have rather than like how you very beautifully described how people use drugs as resources and for important reasons for survival or for leisure or for recreation or for coping or for pain or
Right.
whatever, and totally ignoring the systemic context around it. So it's like the message from this conversation is the mental health system and grad school as a piece of that is just, oh my gosh, it's horrific, it's limited, it's just reductive, it is archaic, it is needs to be critiqued and questioned every step of the way.
Yeah. Absolutely, and I think that's the future is being able to critique it and have a whole new world, a different sort of curriculum where, yeah, maybe having therapy be a part of your training as a requirement makes sense. I think that makes sense personally. Uh, how do you feel about time, by the way?
This is a good stopping point for me.
Okay, sounds good. So then usually I hold a little bit of space in case there was anything else that you wanted to share in our conversation. Otherwise, I do have a closing question that I could
Cool. Yeah,
come
let's
to.
question.
Okay. So the closing question that I ask everyone on the podcast is what is that one thing that you wish other people knew was more normal? And for me, this question has always come from that space of like Yahoo Answers. Like, what is that thing you were Googling going like, am I the only one? Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
Wow, that's such a like I have so many things, and I'm thinking of things that could be like fun and silly, and then I'm thinking of things that are like really deep and
Yeah.
depressed. But when you just said like things that I had Googled, what came up for me really was kind of what we were talking about earlier, which is this I believe it is normal to have a deep sense of loneliness and emptiness. This includes for people who would consider or say that they otherwise have fulfilling lives and good relationships and jobs that they feel passionate about or hobbies and still feeling this like what I would describe and what I describe to my therapist is like a really deep well
Mhm.
that's just like pitch black that I just cannot fill regardless of
Mhm.
how many achievements I have, regardless of
Yeah.
what I try to do to fill, put water in it or put dirt in it or
Right.
whatever, fill that like hole. And I think that that deep sense of loneliness, like this chronic emptiness is much, much more normal than we ever discuss or acknowledge. And I think there's many reasons for it, like lack of emotional connection and feeling seen in childhood, particularly, I think is what leads most adults to have that, even when they have like otherwise fulfilling lives. And it feels confusing because no
Mhm.
one's really talking about it, or no one's talking about it in this way.
Yeah.
Or maybe even it's like a cycle is not having relationships that allow you to feel seen fully. And that's what would fill the emptiness and the loneliness. And we have relationships that I think we think are attempting to do that, but really they aren't. And it's hard, I think, for most of us to figure out where to find those relationships or what to look for or how to do it. So I think I would say that because that's something that I like literally have Googled. It's something that I talk about with my therapist a lot. Something that I'm navigating constantly is like, I have a good life now. Like now that I'm an adult
Mhm.
and I have my autonomy and agency and I have set up my life in the way that I want, I have a good life and feel like chronically unseen. Yeah, like not able to fully be myself with other people. So I think I would say that.
Yeah.
And maybe just even the acknowledgement of that, I think can be helpful. Like knowing that that's not an unusual thing, that is really normal can be a good like starting place.
Totally, totally. As you were saying it, I looked up into the corner because there's a Post-it note that I have that talks about the 4 existential givens of all humans and what we face, right? And it's death, existence, isolation, and meaning.
Yeah.
And I think when we think about the reality of isolation, no matter how good your relationships are, because I think we could have a very nuanced conversation about relationships that aren't meeting us, right? When you're going to the office and you come up and people are like, "How are you?" "Good. How's your weekend?" "Great." And then you go through, you come home, you live alone, or you come home and that's the kind of dynamic you have with your partner,
Yeah.
partners, any sort of space where it's that, I would say, surface, that's isolating. And even if we go to the space where you have great supports, you're really there, really vulnerable, no matter what, no one is ever going to see what you see of the world because that is a given of our existential limitations. Like, I'm experiencing you. No one else can experience this conversation through what I'm experiencing. So I can try and share it with so many different people, but no one's going to get it because no one is myself. And I think we all sit with that we want to be seen, we want to be seen, but the reality of our existential given is that that is always going to be limited.
Yeah. Hmm. That leaves me with a question to think about, which is if we have all of those other things in place, a life that we would consider good otherwise, and
Right.
that we would consider good otherwise, but we have this reality that our unique lens is also uniquely isolating. Is it possible to really be seen then?
Mm, that's
'Cause that would be my reflection question for the day.
totally. That's my
That's interesting to think about is like ultimately, even if we have these things in place, we still have, yeah, this reality that my experience is unique and you will never get it because it is mine only. And so then how do we remedy that? Hmm.
exactly. Maybe the idea at that moment, I was thinking about how we're all one in some way too, right? Like, I will never understand your experience, but in some ways, we all want the same things. We all
Yeah.
crave the same attachments, we all crave those, and so there is that, like, shared like, when you're talking about feeling lonely, like, I know what that feels like because I felt that way, right? Like, I can't know your experience, but I do have the same humanness, and to
Yeah.
know that, right? And so maybe that's where it comes through, and also, I'd be curious, like, what are our expectations of life? Like, life is not always happy
Yeah.
rainbows. What are the parts that we have to sit with that are hard and difficult?
Yeah. I know. And this is the last thing I'll say because I could probably go on forever. But I was also just thinking about how in the US, different like locations value different things, and how I think being someone who lives in the US is so fucking isolating and disconnecting because at the core of like our culture and our values, like is money and capital and growth and like work, which means that built into our culture, there is no prioritizing connectedness. So it's even like, even if I have all of those things set up, I'm still not going to feel connected because we don't even prioritize or value that in any capacity in this culture. Whereas like in some other cultures, or even just thinking about, oh my God, I could go on forever.
You
Even
can
just
do
thinking
it. I'm here for you. I love this.
even just thinking about like this concept of most people, I would say, like our desires in life are like to get more, to make more money, or to become famous, or to reach a higher height professionally. And part of that leads to us culturally not having support systems that support folks who don't have a lot of money, because the idea individually is, well, I'm not going to be that person. I'm going to make more money and I'll access the supports when I get there. Whereas in other cultures, they really deeply value everyone being taken care of financially, communally, whatever the fuck, because people are not actively, consistently, ongoingly seeking more. They are born into this particular financial system, whatever the fuck, or like not caste system, but like socioeconomic status. And that's the one they know that they're going to stay in. So they're wanting to figure out how to make this life meaningful and enjoyable rather than up, 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 up. It is, I'm here. How can I make the best of it so that there are resources and things that make existing in that socioeconomic status livable.
Yeah.
So I feel like that's just the last thing I'll say. But the other piece here is we don't have systems in place that make life like quality of life in terms of connectedness, because the focus in the US at least is more, 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 more rather than, and the focus is just always on, like money and wealth rather than connectedness. So it's just, I think that this is just a really deeply lonely cultural fucking society. So it's hard, but that's all I'm going to say.
It's so good. And I appreciate you saying that because that's all part of this conversation, right? And again, when our whole running theme of this conversation, I think, was like the relationality that we all need, when that's the world that we're living in our society, again, it is no wonder that so many people are on these very medicines,
Yeah.
antipsychotics, these antidepressants, because our culture is framed in that lens, right? Again, that's why I'm always saying, like, we need to be looking at these upstream systemic factors, the culture, the things going on that are creating this, because the problem is frequently not us. It is frequently the relationships that we've been in through our history, generational trauma, and then the societal things that are going on. And if we're not having that nuanced conversation about those things, we're placing the blame on us, on our clients, and saying that you're the reason, when I would say that there are other reasons that are making us suffer.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it was such a pleasure to share space with you. Where would you want to plug so that people can find out about the equitable care work that you're doing and other things so that they can stay connected with you?
Yeah. So you can follow me on Twitter, Raquel, that's RAQUEL_Savage, or Instagram, Raquel Savage. You can support my nonprofit, ZEP Wellness, Z like zebra, EPP, P like Peter, ZEP Wellness, across any social media platforms, and also send donations. We're community based and don't have a lot of funding, so money is very helpful. And then the equitable care certification, similarly, you can just Google that and it'll come up and register for it. The first cohort will be in July and then the second will be in October. It's a 12-week thing. And then you have the requirement to actually see sex workers as clients for free. So yeah, any of those things would be really helpful.
Hell yeah. I'll have all of the links below so people can follow it directly and connect with you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you for coming on the show. If you enjoyed today's episode, then leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to your podcast. And head on over to modernanarchypodcast.com to get resources and learn more about all the things we talked about on today's episode. I want to thank you for tuning in, and I will see you all next week.